nice to meet you. I'm Tristan Grove from IPSI, the Association of Independent Professionals and Self-Employed, and I'm joined by Dame Angela Legal, the MP for Wallasey, a former Minister in the Treasury and the Department of Work and Pensions, and a member of the Treasury Select Committee. I'm also joined by Kate Dearden, who is Policy and External Research Policy and External Relations and Community Union, and also Emma O'Dwyer, who is Head of Labour Relations and Regulatory Policy at KEPA. So in 2017, the Independent Taylor Review made a groundbreaking assessment of the quality of work in the UK. It warned threats ranged against British workers from poor wage growth and a growing skills mismatch, to the burgeoning gig economy and a growing grey area between employment and self-employment. We're here today to ask what, if anything, has changed since then, and more importantly, what needs to change and what could the Labour Party do to bring that about. So I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is just how complicated and fraught this question is, especially in light of the pandemic. On one hand, there is quite a widespread narrative that all self-employment is bad work. But in reality, IPSI research has found 77% of freelancers are actually happy working for themselves. Although the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on this group. In fact, from over 5 million at the start of 2020, the total self-employed population has fallen to 4.3 million now. But as well as these 4.3 million, there is also the gig economy, in which it's estimated 1 in 10 workers participate every week. Though of these, just 8% see it as their main source of income. For many more, the gig economy is used as a side hustle to top up their earnings. And as if that wasn't complicated enough, there is also the world of umbrella companies, largely unregulated third-party businesses that companies use to manage their temporary workforces. It's estimated there are 600,000 temporary workers employed by umbrella companies, a figure that is increasing after the changes to I-35 contract and taxation rules. Among umbrella company workers, stories of withheld holiday pay and wages are common. It's estimated up to £1 billion every year. So from the gig economy and umbrella companies to the grey area between employment and self-employment, the state of work today is a very complex issue. And now we're going to turn to the experts to explore it. So we're going to start with an introduction from each of our experts, and then I've got a few questions for each of them. And then for the last 15 to 20 minutes of the session, I'll open out to the audience. So please do be thinking of questions and get involved in our answer. So now I'll ask Dame Angela Legal to start, if that's okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'm just wearing my Angela Merkel mask, just to sort of mourn her passing, but hope that we'll get a socialist chancellor in Germany at the elections this week. You never know. That's what it's looking like, so we'll put our fingers crossed. This is a very complex area, but it's one that Labour came into being to fix when we were first created. We're not called the Labour Party for nothing. We're there and we were created as a founding principle from the trade unions to try to ensure that the law in our country, as it was developing at the end of the 19th century, actually gave working people a fair deal, rather than seeing them as commodities that could just be added into the mix and not treated like human beings. And that's what trade unions came into being to ensure. But perhaps life was a bit simpler then than it is now. As we've just heard, the level of employment status, the fragmentation of the labour market, the different employment statuses that there are, the way that employment law hasn't kept up with the definition. We don't even have a single definition of what a worker is, by the way, in law at the moment, and that's also a problem. And the things that have come about that we would have said were different forms of working all carry with them different implications and fewer or more employment regulations and rights for those that are involved. And so it's very complex. That's why I welcome the green paper that Adam MacDonald has helped put together over the last period that both Annalisa Dodds and Angela Lever have been talking about in the last day or two. You should get hold of that and have a look at some of the things that that talks about. For example, committed to creating a single status of work, or at least a definition of work, and might be quite a good thing. Then we could tie in the rights and responsibilities of employers, how we can give genuinely self-employed people a good deal in our social security system, because Beveridge didn't really think very much about self-employed people when he was putting together the social security system after the war, and it just hasn't kept up to date with developments. And we've seen what happened with the pandemic when the Chancellor decided he was going to give support to people in the furlough scheme, and then because of the outcry of what was happening with self-employed people, he got the support scheme there. But because there's no definition of what a worker is, it excluded about 3 million people who haven't made national insurance contributions or have a tax return and various other things. And so we got to a situation where some people were being properly protected, others had no protection at all, and there was no real grip in the structure to try to get them protection. And so this really encompasses what has happened in terms of ensuring that those who are self-employed, apparently self-employed, or run their own businesses get a decent deal from the way that the state works, access to social security, and pay the appropriate amount of tax. What's happened with the growth of things like umbrella companies and apparent self-employment rather than actual self-employment is it's been seen as a way of avoiding tax and national insurance, and because the national insurance contributions are at different levels, there's a positive incentive for people to be put into the areas where they are apparently self-employed. When I was Treasury Minister, we tried to do a lot of work on the growth of self-employment and the evasion, I think, of national insurance contributions that were brought about not only by the lump in the building trade, but how that was spreading hospitality and various other areas. Because there's a positive incentive for it to spread, because you pay lower rates of tax if you're self-employed than if you're not. But for workers, they often don't get the choice. It's either incorporate or be self-employed, or you don't get a job. And it's also then taking on to yourself, with very little support, all of the risks of if you're ill or if you can't go on holiday because you don't get paid, if you're ill you don't get sick pay, and all of those things. So we've got to retool the system so that it's fair across the board to everybody, and so that means that people can have a status that doesn't stop people working, but make sure that both employers and employees pay the appropriate amount, and that if you're self-employed, you are actually self-employed rather than being forced to be self-employed by a much bigger and more powerful structure. And we've got to think, talking about Uber, we've got to think how we develop an approach to the platform companies and the things that have been enabled by technical advancements to ensure that they are also included. And I'd just say that the Taylor report was done within very narrow tram lines of what the then Tory government told him he could get away with discussing. I know I talked to him. And even then, when he came out with quite modest proposals, they've done nothing to put any of them onto the statute book. So it's about time we had a profound shake-up. We've got to stop exploitation at the worst end, and that's things like fire and rehire, it's things like 0 hours contracts, fragmented contracts, which carers get a lot, the difference in power between people who are apparently self-employed, but they have to engage with a very much larger provider or supplier of labour opportunities, if I could put it that way. We've got to make certain that we can tie everybody in a fair way to the social security and support system that we've got. So perhaps people who are self-employed can join collectives which allow them to contribute to holiday pay and sick pay, and perhaps the state could put some money into that. There are various potential thoughts about how that might be dealt with, so that we can get the tax system appropriate, and we can move away from low pay, insecure exploitation of a very fragmented workforce, and get back to the principles of why the Labour Party was created in the first place. And we've got to do a proper, decent deal for actually self-employed people, so that they could plug into state support, and if we had another pandemic, there wouldn't be this issue of the excluded, because they'd have been in the system and been properly recognised. So the time we've got is not great. This is a very complex issue, but I hope I've set out some of the basic approaches to it. And there's some very radical stuff which has been published today by Annalise and fronted up by Angela, the other Angela, and a great deal of work done by Andy MacDonald in this area that I think I'm quite excited about. So thanks very much for that.
Thanks, Angela. And Emma, would you like to take it?
I will, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Tristan, Dixie, and SV Labour for having us here today. I'm Emma, I work at Uber, I've been there for 2 years, and I'm the head of Labour Relations. I'm going to say something that will astound you. I am a lifelong Labour Party member.
And not all of them.
But thank you for having me here today. I'm really pleased to actually be able to be here and give you a bit of my perspective as a Labour Party member who works at Uber. But also I'm very keenly aware that Uber are on a very long journey when it comes to this issue as well. So very pleased to have the opportunity to dig into what we think the future should look like, and some of the change as well that we have been through over the last year. I think Tristan made reference to, and some of the changes that are really important, I think, that we should talk about. So I think any conversation on this subject is remiss if we don't talk about the pandemic and the impact that that's had on lots of people who are both self-employed and workers and otherwise last year. I think for our drivers, it really was a twofold issue. The first was just the lockdown, like so many others in hospitality and the art sectors and many other situations, a severe overnight change in the lack of demand for those services, a huge impact, and as Andrew was pointing out, many of them were not entitled to the self-employed scheme, and certainly didn't benefit from things like furlough that some individuals were able to. Secondarily, I think that the pandemic shone a light on some of the iniquities and insecurities that come from the difference in benefits and protections that self-employed or those in the gig economy might have, different to the sorts of things that you or I might take for granted, the ability to work from home if we needed to self-isolate or take time off if we got ill. At Uber, we pay drivers to do both of those things, but many people didn't have that experience, and many others in the gig economy didn't. And so I think that's shone a renewed light, spotlight on this debate, and made it more important than it is today. But you know, Uber is the poster child for the gig economy, but we've always been in favour actually of a conversation that's about how we can have benefits and protections and keep the flexibility that drivers want to benefit from. It's too often this debate is sort of built around a paradigm of having benefits or flexibility, and we just think that that's not the way forward. We also think it's a Supreme Court judgment this year. Those of you who are not aware of it, there was a very big judgment at the beginning of the year about what the status of drivers were who work on a route in the UK. And in March, we announced that all 70,000 drivers in the UK would get worker benefits going forward. In May, we recognised the GMBs, the Union for Drivers, and together, yesterday, we launched the first pension scheme for gig Companies.Is. So drivers get an earnings floor that we negotiate with their union. They get working benefits, holidays and pensions, free sickness and injury insurance at a rate of £65 a day, significantly more than the SSP. And we found a way, through partnership, to offering both flexibility and benefits. We think that's what the future should look like. And we hope that other people can follow that route as well. But I think more than that, we support Labour's push for an employment bill that does two things: clarifies the employment status. Angela points out lots of the confusion that exists these days. Much is about legislation hugely predates the technological advances that we've seen in recent years, but also because it will bring in new enforcement that I think is sadly lacking, and that will create a level playing field that will enable businesses to do the right thing. I think both of those are really important pieces that are not here today. So yeah, thank you for having me.
perspective.
Thanks, Tristan, and great to see you all in person. It's lovely not to run a virtual meeting. It was my first in-person one, and great to see you both as well, Emma and Angela. So I'm from Community Trade Union, and we're a union that represents members in sectors all across the economy, in all forms of work, both employees and self-employed and in between. We're really proud to be a modern trade union for the changing world. We want to be and have to be. And when we look to the gig economy, particularly in particular for relevance to this panel, we want to make a way for innovation to actually work for workers. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about our perspective as a trade union, but also our experience from some of our membership, rather than sort of their experience of the pandemic, but hopefully we can touch on that in the Q&A as well as any other questions you might have. Increasingly, we've talked about people switching jobs, careers and sectors. New technology too has facilitated the growth of the gig economy and fundamentally changed the nature of work, as we've touched on already. And for us as a trade union, that's required us to think differently about how we approach and represent these workers, new members, potential members, how we approach and work with employers, or where there's no employer at all, how we work and engage with the gig economy and with platforms, so that actually we can represent the modern worker and our members as effectively and responsibly as we can. And when we look to good work in particular, the landscape, as we've explored already on the panel, is how the UK labour market is a complete mixed bag when it comes to work and different ways of working. Employment status, employment rights, benefits and wider support varies massively, but I'm going to be focusing on freelance work in the gig economy and how we promote that in terms of good work. Because even in the self-employed and freelance section of the economy, we have to remember, I think it's important to remember, that part of the economy can't be treated in a homogeneous way. It's very, very different in the different ways that people work. Our members, for example, who interact in the gig economy, define themselves on the whole as self-employed, as independent contractors or freelancers or part self-employed. The platforms they might engage with, typically companies like Bolt, TaskRabbit, Deliveroo, and so on and so forth. So it's a real mixed bag in terms of experience of our members. And a key question for us is how we provide fair working conditions that maintain the principle that self-employed workers are free to work as they please, and for all workers to actually engage with the gig economy, that they feel empowered in deciding how and when they engage with their work. So how do we rebalance that power in favour of the worker? And that is an absolutely vital question for us. So to break that down, how those in the gig economy can still benefit from flexibility and independence, which is really important and valued to a lot of our membership, whilst also having the greater protections and rights at work that we've discussed already. Things like holiday pay, basic rate of pay and better rights when it comes to their work. That's what our members tell us. They want better pay, they want access to holiday pay, they want more help and support from organisations that they give their labour to, but they also want the reliability of earnings so that they can budget. And one member told us they know they'll be able to put food on the table at the end of each week. But they're also really invaluable, that flexibility, which is a key part of sort of choosing where and when they work. And we know from our research that the flexibility of that model means that more people are able to access the type of work that they would otherwise not been able to in terms of traditional employment. And the result of that way of working is that it does open up opportunities for people to work who want to work and might otherwise be able to, like amongst our membership, parents of young children, people with disabilities, people who are retired from their traditional employment, and even those who have been made redundant, and that's the opportunities it has provided for them. And for one example, if we look at working mothers, gig work means that they can spend the majority of their time at home, but can earn extra money to help the family along at the same time. And that has given them a way to develop their own professional skills or maintain the growth of their business, whilst also looking after the children. It's that flexibility they favour and the experience they've enjoyed. But as we've said, it shouldn't be a play-off between the two. They shouldn't have to choose that situation. Flexibility and independence, or rights and more benefits. So I think that requires a wider conversation, which is great to have that conversation as part of it today, about security and rights for those workers, no matter their employment status. And government have a huge responsibility in that and a role. In my opinion, I think they're shirking it and are very much leaving it up to the Supreme Court to decide, which is not a way to run an economy that's run and built by workers. But I'm sure we'll touch on that in the question and answer session. But also, what can employers and platforms do? It's a flexibility that the gig economy naturally facilitates that should allow them and platforms to set a higher standard for the rights of workers, and that opportunity should be grasped. And it's really interesting, Emma, to hear about Uber's work on this. But we have to be realistic as well in the current situation with the law that makes it difficult. If companies provide support in one way, they could end up being in the courts with an employment status tribunal that goes on for years, which is why we have to sort out in terms of employment status in the UK. And just to conclude, a lot of our members who are generally self-employed, some in this room today, and work across the gig economy, use a range of platforms. We want to work with them in deciding and promoting a code of best practice across the platform economy and ensuring that workers are treated fairly and within the law. That means we need access to those workers. We have to get access to those platforms, and platform companies in the first instance have to help trade unions facilitate us and actually reach those workers. Because when we're realistic as trade unions, that section of the economy has no awareness of what trade unions do, what we can offer, how we can help them, and how we can strive for good and well-paid work, and they have no connections with other workers in similar circumstances a lot of the time. So how do we help them fight back if people do try to take advantage of labour, or help them if they are low paid and find good quality, well supported work? There's plenty of organisations that do offer that support, but self-employment and in terms of trade unions is not really spoken about enough, and we really want to change that because it is a problem. So to end in a positive, we are really working hard to change that, because from our perspective, the challenge for trade unions, as I spoke about in my opening remarks, is not to rid the world of self-employment and the gig economy. That is not the answer. It's to make this form of work for everyone in a meaningful, fair and decent way, and how we can build on traditional employment that we all know and we're all used to as a basis of a secure foundation, and use that as a broader conception and focus on good work for all, irrespective of employment status.
Thank you very much, Kate. So now I've just got a couple of questions for the panel for myself, and then I'll open up to the floor. So I think we've touched on a couple of times now the issue of how many people in the gig economy are working full time, and how many people are using the gig economy for that flexibility that you described there, Kate. So I think just the first question is, when approaching the gig economy and regulating it, how do we distinguish between these groups? Does anyone want to take that first? Angela, do you have an answer to that?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing we've got to do is get a better idea of the actual statistics. The TUC have done some work, so we know that 1 in 9 workers were in insecure work ahead of the COVID-19 outbreak. More women than men, more BAME people, more younger people, particular sectors. Very high percentages of people who are on 0 hours contracts are on 0 hours contracts not because they want to be, but because that's the only work that they're offered and that's the terms upon which it is offered. So choice is quite important. But I think whilst the government don't really, the Treasury spent most of the first part of the pandemic rowing with the Treasury Select Committee about the numbers of people who were excluded from their schemes, and they still don't accept the numbers that we think, as the Treasury Select Committee, which is cross-party, were excluded, 3 million odd. The government have never accepted that, but nor have they facilitated an appropriate look at what the actual statistics are. So I think from a policy-making point of view, you can have principles. If you want to distinguish between those who are sort of doing extra work or trying to develop a different career, rather than those who are trying to work full time, you've got to have some stats about it, and you can only move forward by talking about principles at the beginning until those stats are available.
Thank you. Emma, this is an issue that Uber's grappled with a bit, hasn't it?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's tough to say, right? Because we're not, and don't really be ideological about whether people should be employed or what. More like, can we continue to provide the client opportunities that we have and do benefits, as Kate pointed out, not put ourselves in a position that's very tricky and difficult, or find ourselves having to move to a shift-based model and think that we completely change the way that drives into us today. I don't know, I was interested in the binary of your question about how long essentially, how much of your work needs to be with somebody before you go and employ that fashion. That's probably one dimension. A couple of ones that came through in the Supreme Court judgment review, but it was also about would like to go far to performing business yourself or not. And there's kind of a lot of dimensions to go through it. But I kind of think in terms of how much people are getting from one job versus another, one source of work with it, plenty of our minders will do full-time hours, but they will do them in a way that changes week to week, and that is around something else that is less flexible that they just do. And it's about the kind of wraparound securities and things that go with that, I think, that can make that work. Figuring out where the threshold is that you move beyond into full-time, and is full-time necessarily inflexible?
Okay, thank you. And Katie, would you?
Not much to add actually, Tristan.
Okay, sorry.
But all I'd say is that I think we do have to think about, when workers are choosing to top up their income a couple hours a week to put food on the table, which is stories that we've heard from our membership. It's because a lot of the time that full-time job doesn't pay well enough and is not good enough, and a lot of the time it's not just that simple choice when people are just using a few hours a week, and that's a whole different wider conversation to have. But yeah, I agree with everything Angela said.
Okay, thank you. And I think another one of the big issues with gig economy that I've touched on here, I think there's a big perception that when people start using platforms, essentially competing for work in an open market, there's kind of a race to the bottom. Is this inevitable with online platforms, and is there anything that can be done to tackle this? Kate, do you want to start?
I don't think it's inevitable now. I think we can start having a wider conversation about how platforms can set good practices, whether it's on health and safety, paid work on time, for all work completed, and have access to representation in the news I spoke about before. But when we look at the wider conversation, into another bigger topic, but around technology at work as well, and how those workers who are engaging with platforms are consulted on their data, consulted on the setup of the algorithm when they're using an app, all these conversations, how we can actually set a bar and a standard that we'd expect workers to have sort of options to engage with when they are engaging with that platform. So I think amongst platforms we can get to a place where we do have some set standards on the basic stuff that hopefully wouldn't end up in the Supreme Court. But again, that's the wider conversation about actually enabling platforms to do that. But no, I don't think it's inevitable at all.
Okay, thank you. Angela?
It's not inevitable, but it does happen quite a lot, and I think part of the difficulty is the lack of the law obviously applying in various places, coupled with the lack of trade union organisation and worker empowerment, whether it's individuals or more collectively, to try and bargain a bit better, to bargain the circumstances up. An algorithm is not an easy thing to bring to the surface if its assumptions have changed and it deprives particular people of work. That can be done pretty surreptitiously without it being transparent. So there are some big issues about how algorithms and work in that kind of context. But I think there are also a lot of bad practices that need to be driven out, because the dynamic of this in a labour market that's as unstructured and with as little protection as ours often has, is that you see a great big exponential growth in 0 hours contracts, because it's so much cheaper and easier to have your workforce like that if everybody else is doing it and your competitors are doing it. How much of a choice do you really have except to compete in a race to the bottom? So if the government allow that sort of cycle to start spiralling down because they don't stop abusers, it will spiral down, and we see that in the fact that 40% of people who are on universal credit just about to get a cut, just as the Tory party conference is finishing up on the 6th of October, are in work, but they're not earning enough work to get off universal credit, and they have to top up because of that. So ideally we would want everyone who works to be able to live and put food on the table as a result of the wages that they get for working or the remuneration they get if they're self-employed. That is what we want to see. We are very far away from that at the moment, and the only way of stopping that happening is to put in legal safeguards and ethical choices which affect companies who decide they're going to behave in that way. Like, I don't know whether Hermes have changed the way that they do things, but 100 deliveries a day, something like about 80p a parcel, and 6 days a week. It's not my idea of a decent kind of level of work. And when we're all running around with Amazon and we're getting our parcels delivered, we need to think about the poor people who have to do their own sorting as part of the day's work before they even set off. And the health and safety of driving 6 or 7 days a week, 12 or 14 hours a day, etc. Provide your own car. You know, the security guard who has to bring their own dog. So, I mean, there are far better ways of doing work, and there is an increasing realisation amongst some platforms, Uber being an obvious one, that they've got to do better than this. And so we raise the floor, we get the law to raise the floor, and then we make it better.
Emma, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I think Kate and Angela kind of mentioned the three that are obvious. One is to make sure the law is in place and up to date. Two, that there's enforcement that works. And three, trade union organising. They've always been the kind of vehicles forward. I do think there's a point to be made about when we talk about gig economy. Do we think of it as a sector in itself, or is it an emerging way of working, or has emerged or is emerging in sectors that have been around for long periods of time? So I think it's often like a misconception, particularly me working with ELS and strong. You know, that's not something called come in and out of it all the time. And secondarily, I would say, at least until recently, the UK has had a relatively open market in all sectors, whether you're self-employed or otherwise. And I think one analysis would say that's we're kind of living political consequences of that. So yeah, I think it's a harder one than status or gig or
So one last question for me, and then I'll open up to the floor. There was quite an interesting recommendation in the Taylor review about the gig economy. The recommendation that gig workers should to allow gig workers to get a fair wage, they should get a piece rate of 1.2 times the minimum wage for people working in the gig economy. So essentially, you would be paid more as a gig worker than an employee would, to ensure that you're still getting a fair wage. It was a recommendation that was quite widely liked at the time, I think, but it's not been adopted. Is this a good idea, and why haven't the Conservatives adopted this, and is it something Labour would consider? Emma, would you like to start?
I have no idea.
Okay.
1.2 for a private hire driver, 1.2 for a courier, 1.2. I think the problem becomes a sectoral one, which is why I actually think very interesting concept was sectoral in that sense. And I just think that I don't know how many nobody really like I said earlier, we now have a negotiation rates with GMB. When we do that, it provides a floor, but most often I think this question assumes that people in probably necessarily doing better, and I think some people are. But drivers, for example, from the moment they log on, the moment they log off, the moment, on average, they're making £17 an hour after all their costs. That's quite a lot. £14 an hour must be paid. That's not just on a long trip, that's their whole time on the trip. So, yeah, I think we can kind of assume that something's fixed sometimes. It's not going to be true for one type of work.
Angela, what do you think about piece rates?
Well, I think it's an odd thing to come up with. I think that Matthew probably came up with it because it was within the tramlines of what the Theresa May government would have allowed, and even then they didn't do it. So I think you need to look much more objectively at what the answer is, and I think a sectoral approach, given that there is very much now a sort of sectoral presence of this kind of work. It's spread to particular sectors more obviously than others. So an answer of having a sort of fair employment contract and a fair sort of price across a sector is quite a good way of trying to put a floor under wages, which is more nuanced, but will obviously be higher or at or around. It won't go under the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a sort of fallback position. I think that's a good way of doing it, which is why it features in the announcements that have been made today.
Okay.
Yes. Also not sure what it happened, but I mean, I guess at the time it was, no one had a solution. It was the first time talking about it on such a large platform in the UK. But on reflection, yes, all platforms do operate differently as well, so it would have to go and sit to all of this. And I think worker transparency on their pay is absolutely key. Throughout any sort of solution, actually understanding their earning potential, and can piecework, the piece rate guarantee a minimum wage, and when you exclude other fees and costs, can we still guarantee that's the case? I think that would be my main question in any approach.
Okay, thank you very much. So are there any questions from the floor? We've got a roving mic, if there are. Should we start?
So I'm Liz Hind. I am one of the good members of Community Union, and I've been working with Kay quite a lot over the last year. One thing that I think is really badly understood about self-employment is things like pay gaps, and even the Labour Party's proposals for gender pay gap reporting and other types of pay gap. They cover the low-hanging fruit of large organisations with 250 employees. So that's 37% of the working population is covered by that sort of pay gap reporting. The Office of National Statistics will write blogs about how difficult it is to understand just how much a self-employed person is earning. So how can we, the evidence is that those pay gaps are wider for self-employed people because you've got to negotiate your own rent. So how can we monitor what's happening with pay gaps, and how can we actually do something to fix them?
Thank you. Do you want to take this question? Should we take a round of three? Yeah. So would you like to go next? Can you do share, please?
Hi there, Simon Gill. I'm a local councillor from Pench, actually, London Borough of Bromley. It's got it from Wait the Brown. You've talked a lot about kind of national government legislation on this, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts on sort of more local authority and licensing views. So one particular issue focusing on the gig economy and delivery drivers. So in our local area, we have an area of our high street which is sort of packed full of delivery drivers, Uber Eats drivers outside of McDonald's. Now, the McDonald's franchise owner obviously has no responsibility for those drivers. You contact one of the companies and if you can even get through to them, most of them don't even have customer service centres, but to complain about a particular driver is almost impossible. And by the nature of the gig economy drivers, these drivers don't necessarily have identifiers or licensing to be able to report them for particularly bad antisocial behaviour or for blocking pavements or parking where they shouldn't be. What role do you think local authorities should have, and what kind of licensing and regulation around gig economy workers do you think is needed?
Thank you very much for that. And we have another question just in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really interesting. The question I have is really fundamentally to do with employment status and whether you think a solution to the issue of having employees, workers and the self-employed and a kind of grey area between the three of them is a solution that we should have just one employee status and self-employed, or I wonder how else the panel of experts think this issue could be resolved.
Thank you very much. So should we start with gender pay gap reporting then? Emma, would you like to start?
I can have a go. I have to admit, this won't surprise anybody who's got an Uber recently, but the vast majority of our drivers are men. And that relates actually much more to do with the perception of safety in terms of that kind of work and whether women want to do it or feel safe doing it. But one observation I would make that that I think is interesting is that most of our drivers come from South Asian or immigrant communities, and many of them will tell me that the opportunity to be your own boss is a key driver in that, and feeling like that can in some ways, I think, mitigate against discrimination. I'm sure that, speaking without pure expertise on this, does play into pay gaps of different sorts as well. Do you want us to take all three, or
Would you like to just say one to start with?
which way we go? Three or one?
Gender pay gap reporting to start with. Should we just stick on one subject?
Well, I mean, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about us not knowing enough about this area, and we have to try to study it more. You can only study it more by bringing it into the light, so to speak. And so long as quite a bit of it is associated with avoiding tax, because of the different statuses that initially puts in the door straight away. And so I really think it comes down to trying to create a circumstance where there isn't a tax incentive to be either or. It's called the three-body problem if you're in economics, that there's different statuses and you get treated, you're doing the same thing, you could even be doing the same thing in the same workplace and be completely treated differently for tax purposes depending on your status. And whether this is an appropriate way of doing public policy, clearly it isn't, and it creates a lot of disparities and issues. Which only add to the complication of trying to find out what the gender pay gaps are. I think transparency, as was said earlier, is the only way of dealing with gender pay gaps, so that we can try to ensure that we can minimise them as much as possible.
Okay.
Yes, this is one of my biggest gripes, is that the government have a lot of data that they're just not using, and that we have no idea about the gender pay gap in self-employment, but we know it exists. I think, and I hope, that making tax digital will actually give the government no excuses. They'll have the data in front of them, it will be very clear, very obvious, and we'll have more information about the self-employed workforce. That's a strong hope. But of course it exists, and we can put on as many courses about confidence setting for women in self-employment, how to negotiate your own rates, when to say no, when to pull your work away, which is a difficult conversation for many self-employed women workers to have. That is part of it, but also, as Angela said, there's transparency in different sectors within self-employment. What is the going rate that you understand and everyone is aware of? Where do you set yourself amongst other self-employed workers? But it does come to government and understand that data, understanding what's going on, how big is the gap, and also, for employers and clients, that they also know where the mark is and that they shouldn't be giving someone less than they deserve for that work. So that everyone is aware of it and there's no excuses, but there'll still be a long battle to go, as with employment still. But yeah, more transparency is definitely needed.
And is there a role for local authorities in regulating the gig economy?
I was going to pass this question
Oh,
on.
yeah. Would you like to go?
I think that because this is a sort of platform-driven, bottom-up thing that's happened because of technological advance, we've got into various places where it's completely evaded regulation, and it's not clear who is responsible. So, I mean, Airbnb, if you talk to people in Barcelona who've been frantically trying to get their hotels up to scratch and ensure that there's not too many tourists at a particular place because of capacity for hotels, get all of their efforts completely undermined and blown out of the water by the Airbnb phenomenon, and then they can't even get to the stage where they can guarantee that the Airbnb residences are safe. The whole place gets completely swamped in an uncontrolled way, and it has a whole load of other effects that nobody takes responsibility for. So we have to have obviously a much more regulated, a much more modernised way of regulating things. And we've got, I think in the last 11 years of the kind of austerity that we've had, enforcement has gone out of the window in this country, and that's not local authorities' fault. You've had your budgets, I was going to say decimated, but it's decimated times 5 about. And therefore the stuff that used to be about enforcement has completely disappeared, and it's far more Wild West out there. So I don't have a straight answer, but I do know that it's about enforcement. It's about thinking about the macro effects of these micro developments and what they have when you see them gathered together in that uncontrolled way. So enforcement powers and regulations have to be modernised so that they can deal with this kind of issue. And you can have the most perfect laws in the world. If you've got no enforcement arm, you might as well not bother.
Thank you. I'm a Lewisham resident myself, so we can talk about it afterwards if you'd like. So I work for Uber and the driver side. I don't work for Uber, so we shouldn't speak for them. But I do know that they spend quite a lot of time engaging with councils to talk about this problem, and also with the restaurant partners as well. To Angela's point, I'm not sure whether the solution is local government licensing. Obviously, I have a lot of experience of that on the minicab side. But yeah, they're hugely stretched. Is that the right place that it should sit? I don't know, but it's an interesting question. I guess I would ask back to you whether you think that responsibility should be on the couriers, or whether it should sit with the companies, or whether it should sit with third parties. But yeah, certainly one that I think people need to get to grips with.
And finally, should there be just a distinction between employees and self-employed? Do you want to take that one as well?
I think it was one status, wasn't it? Was your proposal?
Yes, my question was whether you thought that there should be a single employee status rather than having employees, workers, and if not self-employed. Should there be a big category for people who are employees and self-employed, or one whole category, or how you thought it should be better done?
I think I would probably go back to my point before, that it's it's not really for me or for Uber to say this is what we think the UK should have in terms of its employment status.
I'd like to hear your view.
You want to say my view? Well, my view is still that you should be able to provide flexible work opportunities and benefits and find a way to make those things coexist. Maybe you need to have a conversation about your wraparound social security that can work for that, and taxation is obviously a piece of that puzzle. But again, it is for the government, the UK, for the people to vote for what it is they want to see and the reforms they think that should exist. I do think we're in favour of greater clarity and clearly, a lot of the legislation that underpins the judgments we've seen coming through goes back to 1996, and some of the, I guess, slowness with which the government is coming to address this issue is also driven by their concern that, if they change it, they're going to upend a whole load of case law that's gone through over the years. And I think that is very tricky, and I'm not sure that just changing the status gets you out of really difficult legal questions around how this applies in this sector or this and others. And one of the things I think that we've been kind of toying with is whether you need to get to that level of sectoral guidance in order for it to be clear where enforcement needs to be applied or where status is applied in certain sectors. But yeah, tricky one.
I think it's just the $64,000 question which you've asked and demanded that we all have a view. It's quite difficult, and I know that some of the best lawyers the Labour Party knows are currently working on what a single employment status might look like. We've announced that that's what we want to try to bring about. I do think that beefed up enforcement of existing laws, and essentially that's what the court cases taking platform companies to court have tried to be doing, and it's been left to our trade union colleagues to do that rather than the government to try and enforce anything. So enforcement of current laws and regulations would be helpful rather than this kind of Wild West labour market we've got at the moment, where very, very many people aren't unionised. I mean, in the private sector, it's far too many. I won't quote the percentage because I don't want to be critical of our trade union colleagues. It's we need far more unionisation to empower workers. But I also think we need to remove, one way or the other, and perhaps over time, the tax incentives to be one thing or the other, because it simply isn't fair to put more pressure on people to take more of the risk themselves of illness or no holiday pay when they don't effectively have an option. They're being offered work of a particular status, whether they like it or not. They're being offered 0 hours contracts, whether they like them or not, and they don't have an option. So I do think giving people a real choice, not a Hobson's choice, might be might have some sort of way of dealing with this, and removing the tax incentives to be one thing or the other, beefing up enforcement.
I think we are almost out of time, so have you got a last thought on that, Kate?
I'll be quick.
Thank you.
I appreciate directness, we can't blag our way up this and come I think Labour's suggestion about sort of, aside from the genuinely self-employed, putting people into a worker status is an interesting one, primarily because what Angela said in terms of a simpler approach to the absolute maze of employment status that we're in at the moment, and actually putting the onus on the employer to prove the working those working for them are self-employed rather than the other way around. If they do have a dispute over employment status, would resolve that to an extent. Angela and I have spoken about this before, and it's not setting an easy goal, but as part of Taylor Review we call for a statutory definition of self-employment, partly because we got so fed up with just talk about bogus self-employment. Actually, how can we have a definition for self-employment, how it has changed over the years, but it's not just sole traders, freelancers, partners or subcontractors, but we actually explore the wider definitions of limited companies, agency or casual workers, and everything else who are self-employed but the legal status is different. So I think, there's not an easy answer unfortunately to this one. I think we have to review every single status, who would fit in it, what does it look like, who would be impacted, before we can do a simple tick box. But it's a difficult one.
Thank you very much, and I'm afraid I think we need to move it there. So thank you very much to our speakers.